This presentation I would want to give at an LA museum, specifically like a Getty Museum or any of those, where they would talk about the history of LA, the history specifically on the Communist Party and how Americans viewed communism and how the LA Times represented them and how they actually influenced how they viewed communists. First, the background on the LA Times. The LA Times was actually very heavily influenced by post World War II eras, which was very patriotic, and they were talking about the greatness of democracy and the fight for freedom from communism. So during the 1960s, the owner was Otis Chandler, who adopted a more national focus. He sought to remake the paper into a model of the nation's most respected papers, which was the New York Times and the Washington Post. Chandler actually increased the size of his reporting staff and expanded its view from just LA to a national and into an international reporting. They were publishing articles that were very anti-communist and causing more hatred towards the party. The LA Times was responsible for the spreading of the news on how to spot, organize, and bring communists down with the help of religious organizations. The government during this time was very anti-communist. So before World War II, um, the Smith Act of 1940 prohibited anybody from advocating the overthrow of the government by force and violence. And the overthrow of the government is actually one of the fundamental ideals of communism, is that they fight the revolution. Second was the International Security Act of 1950 that required members of the party to file with the Attorney General over everything that they did. So the Attorney General had to get reportings on everything that the member did. Everything, who they talked to, what they talked about, why they were talking about it, why did they meet at that time. Everything had to be recorded. And this was all during the rule of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was very influential throughout the 1950 through 1954. And throughout his times, many were accused and were blacklisted. They lost their jobs, and many did not even belong to the Communist Party. They were just being outed by the people just so that they can get a sense of patriotic viewpoint, like they were being good American citizens catching communists. In California, actually, there was the education code, which actually prohibited communists from teaching. And the LA Times actually stated that in their article, talking, like spreading these news, stating that any employee who knowingly becomes a communist hereafter will be guilty of insubordination and shall be dismissed. So teachers at this time, even college professors at the university levels, had to take an oath and pledge that they were against communists, that they were for democracy in America. And if you were outed as a communist, or if you had to state your own party, you would be fired if you're a communist. You would lose your job. The Communist Control Act during this time in 1954 denied privileges such as permits or licenses for the Communist Party. So they couldn't really hold any public events or anything. And the US District Attorney, Judge A. Pickard, was actually very against communists. And throughout his judge rule, he was known to be very aggressive against anybody that was accused of being a communist. To On one of his sentences, he stated to the six leaders that they're Russian goats, that they are not meteorites, that they are not there for the good of the people, that they are there to bring injustice to everybody, specifically the American people. Communism during LA, it rose during the time because first they came and they were talking to workers. So workers throughout this time in California, they were very underrepresented, and many were not being treated right. So the original members of the Communist Party in California were actually members of the industrial workers of the world who wanted unionization at work. They wanted better treatment. But this was during the height of the McCarthy era, and the Communist Party actually moved its leadership underground. One of the leaders was Dorothy Healy, who talked about what communists actually believed in. And they weren't so-called crazy believers of Russia. They actually believed more in Cuba and Vietnam, because that is where they saw communism rise from a revolutionary standpoint. They were trying to stop segregation from happening. They were helping those that were racially discriminated against, and they were just being lawyers and helping everybody, helping specifically the citizens of LA fight against these jurisdictions that were imposed upon them. The Red Scare actually scared everybody into being anti-communist. The Cold War era was a fight of communism. It was the fight between communism and democracy. And these tactics that were used to fight communism in the articles were actually a way of hiding the real news that was happening. So there was a lot of housing acts that took people away from homes and everything. And although they were talked about, they weren't talked about at a national level, because the actual war was with communism. It wasn't within its people. And Don Parsons stated in his article, looking back, that the Red Scare was actually silly, because they were attacking the Communist Party just because they were afraid of Russia. They viewed the Communist Party as being puppets of Russia. The United States was actually trying to stop communism from in other countries, but they also had to think about fighting communism in their land, in the US. So Americans were told by the governments that the communism was trying to attack people, that they were getting more followers because communism claims that they have success on ideals that they want, on segregation laws, on any of that. They were stating that the Communist Party was stating that they were having successes, but they weren't, because this wasn't just an issue that they could solve. It was an American issue that had to be solved through democracy, not through communism. And during this time, actually, there was Disneyland that opened its doors to anti-communism data, which was a Christian anti-communism crusade, which talked about communism to the public in order for them to know what it was and how they can prepare themselves to fight against them. So a communist by in the LATimes, specifically on who are communists and why. There was no author, but it's on its article they stated that a communist has their thinking taken away, and that they have no thinking, that no communist is allowed to have any pleas of his own, that he believes what he is told, and he is told what to believe. They are a sheep in a herd. They are just following the leader, and to them, their leader, to the American, the leader of the Communist Party was Russia. That's who their enemy is. You cannot be going and stating that you're in a Communist Party, because then that means that you are following Russia's orders. In this particular article, the author wrote that communists are liars, that they're spreading false accusations of what they have done, of the greatness that they have done. But their main ideal is to destroy democracy. There was an article that was talked about. There was an article titled "Understanding Communism," and in this article, the journalist wrote, appealing to the citizens that they can take action against communism. He stated that communism is actually can be fought. and it gave an insight to readers on how severe the fight was. Roger Swearingen wrote on his article, Understanding Communism, that the Communist Party of the US differed in fundamental ways because of its location of final authority, but also on its ideology, organization, and responsibilities, because they were different than the US. They looked at their leader, who was Russia. Their orders are being followed through overseas. Their ideologies aren't even American, so they shouldn't even be classified as an American party. The United States was seen as a good guy. They just wanted peace. They wanted peace, and they promised equality and freedom to any other country. So they were going into the other countries and trying to help them. The government, the United States government, did not impose their government on any other nations, just like communism was. When communism went to a country to help them, they were actually telling those in the nations to become communist. For example, Cuba, China, any of them, they were being followed, or they were being aided by communist people, and they actually took their communist ideals. So the American people were actually afraid of this domino effect that would take place. So the US would actually go and help the other nations reach their goals of freedom without them falling to communism. This article that he wrote was actually very informative of the threat of Russia, because they, in this article specifically, they Roger stated that communism was not the real enemy, that the real enemy was Russia and on what they wanted the people to do. So the government and state levels attacks were keeping Americans safe. What the government was doing in fighting communism and arresting them was actually keeping the Americans safe of this unsafe ideology. He also wrote an article titled "The World of Communism Challenges Freedom," and he stated that the communists have declared war on us, a war that was waged with ideas, propaganda, economic aid. So his article gave the idea that communism was attacking the world. This domino effect would eventually reach America, but America was actually the hero in the story because America wants liberty. They're protecting the right against the party that supported the overthrow of the government. So they were trying to stop this party from even rising up because they were the villain. He wrote on his article, one final suggestion: don't be satisfied with the brief or incomplete answer. Don't take the communist word for it. In fact, don't take anyone, individuals, or organizations' word on it. He portrayed the idea that communism was out to get everyone's freedom and that it was an organization that supported no other views besides their own. Religion actually took a very strong standpoint against communism, and the help of churches in politics was actually starting to grow a lot during this time, mainly because they believed that atheism was rising because of communism. So to defeat God's US enemy, Satan, churches had to get involved to win the war, because conservatives believed that Christians had a more responsibility to combat the evil force of communism. Government officials, anti-communist organizations, and even popular culture sources were rife with language about fighting this evil empire, warning against the communism's atheism. And they declared that the decrematic Christian world had to combat this sinister force. And this was all written down by David E. Settle in his article. Billy Graham actually stated about how there was this war against religion because the world was divided into two fractions: the Western culture, which had its foundations in the Bible, and then there was communism. There was no other part of the world. It was just the Bible and communism. That's it. There was no in between. He stated, Dr. Billy Graham stated, that the only thing that can stop a third world war is a religious revival. Guns are not enough to stop communism. Only God can hold it back. So he went on to spread his word against communism, but in order to fight communism, they had to be Christians. Billy Graham attended a press conference in LA, and he stated that sin has destroyed every other nation. The only answer to communism is Christ. If we reject him, it is winter for the civilization of the West. So conservative Americans throughout this time were actually very fearful of what communism can bring because it was their responsibility to fight evil. They had to stop this evil force from taking over the world. So Christian anti-communism crusades were starting to occur, and on this article called "Tuned for Americans: Crusaders' Anti-Red Folk Songs," LATimes actually shared a song that was written by Janet Green, who followed the tune of Blue Till Fly by Jimmy Crack-Horn, which was very famous in the 50s. And the lyrics of the song was, "Communism is on the rise and Satan has a new disguise," going formal about Billy Graham, who stated that communism is Satan. They are evil. This war of ideologies was being taken this war of ideologies was taken seriously by Christians, and they were starting to get involved in the Cold War by creating an evil attire to communists. The US had been tied to a Christian-born nation, therefore to have relations with the godless nation is dangerous. They perceived that it was dangerous to have communism because it was anti-God. Overall, the Cold War caused chaos to citizens of the Los Angeles era thanks to the publications of the LATimes. Most of the articles were based on their stand of the Red Scare that was sweeping the nation apart. From journalists to the government to the school board and even religion, they all had a statement on what the war of communism was. Each stated what communism was and why it was dangerous. The Los Angeles Times gave more fear to the people because they looked down upon it. Communism today is still severely looked down upon, even with a brief statement that has anything to do with a communist ideal or a socialist ideal is disregarded. The 2016 and 2020 former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders was not given the benefit of a doubt when he included some socialist reforms to his presidency platform. The hatred of socialism was brought upon by publications that described communism as being maleficent and godless. Conservatives in politics have held onto the fear that was imposed by not just the LATimes, but by the government that socialism is never the answer. The fear of any socialist ideals in governments has stopped the opportunity for creating a better nation because of what communism has been portrayed to be since the 40s. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.